morning. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I want to just first welcome folks on behalf of WFAE. We are Charlotte's NPR news source, and you've probably heard many of the voices that you'll be hearing today, not only on air during fundraising drives and things like that, but also in community settings. I, as Chris said, am the executive editor at WFAE, which means that I'm in charge of our local newsroom. So I plan and edit our local news coverage and plan that out throughout the day. It's a window and a privilege to see into this community and to see many of the major issues that we have. And, oh, thank you, Eric, for making me sound better. You might notice I suddenly sound a lot better. That is not because I finally hit puberty, it's because Eric is adjusting our speakers. I've been a reporter and a journalist here in Charlotte for more than 16 years now, since 2009. The biggest chunk of that time I spent at the Charlotte Observer, where for about 5 to 6 years I was the growth and development reporter, writing about Charlotte's growth and growing pains. That was kind of how I defined my beat. Over that time, in the mid to late 2010s, I got the chance to see the effects, both positive and negative, of housing growth, of neighborhood change, of gentrification, of all of these forces, these big market forces that come to bear on individual people and individual lives in really vivid ways. And over that time, I became convinced that Charlotte is, one, a much more interesting and significant city than people tend to give it credit for. I don't know if you saw during the PGA Championship, but someone called Charlotte Diet Atlanta. No, I don't think that's true. We're at least diet, at least regular Atlanta, but we're at least as interesting. But Charlotte is a really representative city of many of the trends that have shaped the U.S. and communities throughout here. Many more cities in the U.S. look like Charlotte than look like New York, and the Southeast as a whole has become an engine of growth. That growth, as I said, has had positive and negative effects. I think a lot of times as a development reporter, I would hear people saying, why don't we just stop the growth? Why doesn't City Council just say no to all these new developments? Why do they keep building new apartments? And then at the same time, I would turn around and talk to many developers and housing advocates, and they would say, why can't City Council just say yes? Why are they always saying no and making it so hard to build all these new apartments and all this new housing? This is a desirable place and people want to live here, and we need to build more housing to accommodate them. So reporting on Charlotte's growth, development, and housing, I often felt like I was in the middle of kind of a contradictory web of perceptions. There are many people who want the growth to stop, and there are many people who want the growth to accelerate, and everybody thinks that their solution is the best, the only, the right way to address the problems that we face. So I never figured it out. I was a growth and development reporter for a number of years, and then I left to go work at UNC Charlotte's Urban Institute and continued working on a lot of housing-related issues with a lot of really smart people. We never figured it out either. And then a few years ago, almost 3 years ago, I got the chance to come to WFAE. We have spent many years reporting on housing issues, on growth and development issues, including several years ago, the Finding Home series that WFAE published for an entire year about housing-related stories, and we never figured it out either. That's another thing that I think is really interesting and key to why housing is a topic that we can come back to and have multiple housing summits about, why it's a topic that we can continue to write and report about and continue to have community conversations about for so many years, because if you look around the US, nobody has figured it out. Pretty much everywhere is dealing with many of the same issues: rising costs, lower availability, an inability of developers to keep up with demand. There is a huge deficit of houses and apartments compared to the number of households that need them in most cities. And at the same time, an inability of neighborhoods to deal with the growth that's coming. So you have all these really contradictory streams that come into focus around housing. Not enough supply, not enough demand, and there's mismatches. And that, I think, keeps it really interesting. The other thing that I became convinced of as I learned about the history of Charlotte's housing market, the current struggles of Charlotte's housing market, is that housing is really an everything story. And what I mean by that is every reporter who's on a beat likes to say or likes to think that their beat is the most important one and the one where everything really comes together. But I say this as a very biased person. In housing, it's actually true. Housing is a business story. Of course, the housing market is one of the most important economic engines of any city and of the US as a whole. It makes up a very large share of our GDP relative to other industries, employs tons of people in construction, in renovation, in development, in property management for rentals. So housing is a huge business story. Housing is a tariff story. You have tariffs on Canadian softwood that could drive up the price of housing. You have tariffs on appliances that will drive up the price of housing. Housing is an education story. Most cities, including Charlotte, have largely residential-based attendance zones, which means where you live plays a huge role in determining where you go to school. And pockets of poverty, pockets of wealth create schools that are pockets of poverty and pockets of wealth. And those become self-reinforcing cycles over the years. As you look at a neighborhood, what's the first thing you look at when you're on Zillow? Oh, what's the schools rating here? Ooh, this house is a good deal, but oh man, that elementary school's got an F rating. I'm gonna look somewhere else. You get these reinforcing cycles where you live influences where your kids go to school, which influences the quality and the rankings of those schools, which influences who wants to live there, which influences who goes to school there. So housing is an education story. Housing is a health story. People who live in older houses tend to deal with more mold, more lead contamination, which is still common in so many houses built before lead paint was banned in the US. Children who live and grow up in these houses tend to have more rates of asthma, higher rates of lead poisoning, higher lead in their blood. So housing is a health story. Also, because of where we have historically built highways and major infrastructure like factories and like I-85, I-77, 74, NC-16. Those don't go through South Charlotte and the Southeast Wedge. Those go through the area that we have historically called the Crescent, the lower income neighborhoods. That's where we have located rail yards and highways and large industrial sites that produce a lot of pollution, that produce a lot of diesel exhaust. So housing is a health story in that way as well. Housing is a character story. There is a children's book that I like to read to my kids. As far as I know, it's the only children's book that is a direct parable about zoning laws and HOAs. It's called The Big Orange Splot. Have any of y'all read it? Okay, well, the librarian, I mean. Yeah, okay. I think you're kind of obligated to. The plot of the Big Orange Splot is that there's a street where it's neat and tidy, all the houses look the same, everybody loves their house. One day, a bird drops orange paint on one house. I don't know how it was carrying a whole paint bucket. It was a big bird, I guess. House has a big orange splot. The guy refuses to paint it. Everyone realizes that their zoning rules are bad, and they paint their houses the way they want them. And I'm not sure who wrote it, but it's very good anti-HOA propaganda to, kind of indoctrinate young people with. But the kind of line that they keep coming back to is, my house is where I live, it's where I like to be, and it looks like all my hopes and dreams. And that is very true. Housing is a character story because we talk about neighborhood character, and that means something to people. When I was a development reporter, one of the first mistakes I made was calling the Villa Heights neighborhood NODA in a story. And, well, you're like looking at me angry, okay. And right away, I was getting phone calls and emails from people who lived there and people who grew up there saying like, whoa, 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 what are you doing? What's wrong with you? I learned very quickly that housing is a story about where people live, where they choose to make their lives, where they are obligated to make their lives by the larger forces of society, and what those lives end up looking like. Housing matters deeply to people because it is so personal. Whether you are someone who lives out of a van, someone who lives in an apartment, someone who lives in a 50s ranch house, someone who lives in an old mill house up there, someone who lives in a mansion on the lake, your house is very personal. Housing is also deeply intertwined in the stories of how our lives play out. You are shaped by the neighborhood you grow up in, you are shaped by the neighborhood you are able to move to, and in many cases, your children are shaped by those decisions and choices that you are able to make for yourself or that are imposed upon you. I see housing play out in my own life. My mother was a single mother in suburban Maryland, and we were able to live in a house that I believe she purchased in the mid-'80s for about, I think like $100,000. And this is right outside DC, so it's a good neighborhood in Montgomery County. It was affordable at that time. And as the child of a single parent, I was able to grow up in that school district, Montgomery County, Maryland, which is one of the top-rated school districts nationally most years. I was able to attend schools that were intentionally created as mixed income, mixed race schools through a very aggressive magnet program and busing program that Montgomery County, Maryland maintained at the time. I was able to go to school with the kids from my neighborhood, the kids from the apartments a mile away right on the PG County line that were very low income and pretty much 100% Latino. And I was able to go to the same schools with people including the sons of Congress people and other DC muckety-muck types who lived in neighborhoods in what we called Up County, the Potomac, Maryland area, in Bethesda. And that shaped the course of my life. That was hugely influential that my mom was able to buy a house, could afford to buy a house as a single mother who worked in public schools. And I look at the neighborhood I grew up in now, and it's still pretty mixed, but that's largely not the case. It has changed quite a lot. And if you've looked on real estate here in Charlotte, you've probably seen the same thing happen in many Charlotte neighborhoods. My wife and I, right before the pandemic, I promise we didn't know it was going to happen and we didn't cause it, but we closed on our house the month before the world shut down, and real estate really went crazy here. And we saw over the next 3 years, well, actually, no, gosh, what year is it? Is it 2025? Okay. Over the next 5 years, I can't believe it. The house next to us sold for about 25% more than we paid. The next year, the house across the street from us sold for about 50% more. The next year, they flipped that house, the same house, and it sold for almost double what we had paid. Then a house down the street, I guess 3 years after we bought, sold for more than double what we paid for our house. And then last year, another house down the street sold for about 4 times what we had paid. So as I walk around our neighborhood, I often have the sense of being the last one to a party and getting in somewhere right before the door slammed shut. My children we live kind of off Sardis and Monroe Roads, in that area between those. My children are fortunate to be in an attendance zone for a public school that is highly rated, and I know that this is going to influence the course of their lives and help them. And I wonder about the people who are similar to us, who have children a similar age, or maybe a little younger, who are not going to be able to buy into and live in our neighborhood. I worry about the person who didn't get in before the door slammed shut. And that's a tough thing to consider as someone who writes about and cares about and has followed a lot of housing stuff. It's personal. Every one of us lives somewhere, and every one of us is involved in these issues in some way. Housing is also a racial story. Tom Hanchett here has written a number of books, 2, which I believe is a number, about housing in Charlotte, including Sorting Out the New South City, which details how we came to be a segregated city in Charlotte, and his new book, which is right there, about the history of affordable housing in Charlotte. Housing is much more than many other stories that we might think of as racialized, like policing or education. Housing is an extremely racialized story in America, and what your skin looks like has directly played into where you could live for many years in this country. Housing is also a economic mobility story. Housing and your home is the largest vehicle of wealth for many people in the US, for most families. Whether your family, whether your grandparents even could buy a house, were precluded from buying a house, or bought a house in a neighborhood that appreciated it or not, has a huge influence on your family's wealth through the generations and on Charlotte's economic mobility, which, since that report came out more than 10 years ago, ranking Charlotte lowest for economic mobility, has been a huge focus for this community. Housing is an economic mobility story. And finally, I would say housing is also a story that defines not just those tangible things that I was talking about, but also a lot of the intangible things of a city, of a community. Think of row houses in Brooklyn. Think of a neighborhood like Eastover or next to a golf course. Think of a rundown neighborhood like you might have seen on TV shows like The Wire, that I know, as someone from Maryland, has defined and bedeviled Baltimore since those rundown neighborhoods were put on TV. That was like 20 years ago. Housing defines something ineffable in addition to the tangible things that it defines. Housing is very fundamental, not just to individuals, but to communities as a whole. So, housing is the everything story. Nobody has solved affordable housing, and I'm going to posit right before we get started with our first real meat here that housing is not a problem you can solve, because if we could solve, in air quotes, housing, we would be in effect solving racial discrimination, health disparities, educational disparities, economic mobility, intergenerational wealth, and maybe, well, okay. I was going to say maybe I am a cynic and a pessimist, but it goes with my profession as a journalist. I just don't think there is a silver bullet that solves all of those giant problems in one go. But that doesn't mean that there is nothing we can do to make this problem better and to address many aspects of it. We'll be talking about that, hearing about that from practitioners, people who are directly involved today, and from journalists who have covered this issue.